Cernovich's page?
Yep, I think we're live right now. I'm going to double check.
Okay. I'm going to go over to his page so I can retweet it.
I believe we are live. In case we are, welcome to American Revolution. I am your host, Andrew Meyer. And sometimes we do this. We jump on Mike Cernovich's Facebook page to get the message out, the big time message, especially when it's as important as this. We're talking today about homeschooling. And for people that don't know, the public schools have been a big problem for a long time. The public schools, they do quite a number on a lot of children. And with us today is journalist Alex Newman. I think he might be the #1 advocate for homeschooling in America as far as journalism goes and knowing what the score really is. So Alex Newman, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. And it's great to catch up after all these years. So thank you for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, for people that don't know, we were talking right before the stream. Alex and I went to the University of Florida at the same time. So you had this is not to brag, but you have two of the most brilliant minds in America at the same college at the same time. And it wasn't Harvard. And we'll talk about Harvard a little bit later. So, Alex, the first thing I wanted to ask you, because, I have a lot of friends that are actually public school teachers, women. And when I talk to them about public schooling, they ban me from their social media. They won't talk to me anymore. They got very irate. They think public schooling is very good for children, but both of us know it hasn't worked out so good for kids. Can you tell people first, just on performance, is there an illiteracy problem with public schools, and why do you think that is?
Oh, goodness. The illiteracy problem is the 8 billion pound gorilla in the room, Andrew. And we know exactly where it comes from. In fact, I wrote a whole book about it with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, who is probably the world's leading expert in this subject. He wrote multiple books about why this was. And so what happened, I'll condense, 150 years of history into maybe 30 seconds. You had this socialist, humanist, utopian named Horace Mann. He became the first ever Secretary of Education for an American state. Prior to that, government really did not have at least any significant role in education. And he tried out this new experiment where they were going to use what they called the whole word method of teaching reading to children. And in their defense, they might not have known how horrible it was. It was actually developed with the best of intentions. It was designed to teach deaf children how to read, because deaf children can't hear what sound a letter makes. And so they had to come up with another way. You and I know that a P makes a P sound, and you combine it with an A and it says pa. But you can't teach that to a deaf child because they can't understand the sounds that you're making. So what this Reverend Golodet figured out was, hey, we can teach them to memorize entire words as if the word itself were a symbol rather than a collection of symbols, each letter being a symbol. And that way they'll at least be able to decipher some of what's written on the page. Well, it was a great idea for deaf children. Hands down, it was awesome. Suddenly, the written word became at least partially accessible to deaf children. So that was great. Well, Horace Mann decided to try this out in the government schools he was creating in Boston. This was back in the early 1840s. And it only took a few years, Andrew, for all of the schoolmasters in the city of Boston. They all got together. They wrote a brilliant essay. Dr. Sam Blumenfeld actually republished it in a book that I have behind me called The New Illiterates that was published in 1973. Mind you, this was 150 years ago. They debunked this. They said, maybe he had good intentions, but sorry, this doesn't work. We're just not going to use it anymore. It's not logical. It doesn't make sense. And we can now see that it doesn't work, so we won't use it. Well, fast forward 50 years. It was taken out right away after that. Fast forward 50 years, a guy called John Dewey, an actual communist. He went to the Soviet Union and loved it, openly wanted to dumb down children. We reprinted his essay in here, The Primary Education Fetish, where he says that we really need to stop spending all this time teaching little kids how to read and write and do math, when really what they need is to be properly socialized and collectivized. And he resurrected this quackery, knowing full well what it was going to do. He actually set up an experimental school with Rockefeller money and $3 million. And they graduated a bunch of illiterate children who couldn't read. And John Dewey thought, hey, this will be phenomenal. Long story short, they created a bunch of reading primers, Dick and Jane, the Macmillan series. And after World War II, these became widely adopted in the United States. They were again exposed as quackery in the early 1950s when Rudolph Flesch published Why Johnny Can't Read. And yet, fast forward to today, under Common Core standards, If you read the Common Core standards for kindergarten, what you'll see is a requirement for little children to memorize sight words. And, this has caused a massive illiteracy problem. And you don't have to believe me. The government will very proudly tell you. You can read the National Assessment of Educational Progress. You can see even in the adults, the National Adult Literacy Survey that the federal government has been doing every decade. Again, they've revealed that we have a staggering illiteracy crisis. Tens of millions, maybe more, of Americans are functionally illiterate, and even many who can read something are very, very poor readers. So, crazy story.
It's depressing. I volunteered at a public school about 7 years ago. I was doing an after-school program, actually, that was amazing. It's called Spirituality for Kids, where we teach kids how to develop emotional resiliency and other things. But we'd go into these classrooms, and you could see that the kids really struggled reading. And it was just so sad to see. And I think this is even before the adoption of Common Core. Just the level of care in the public schools is just so low. And then you add on all of this brainwashing that they're trying to do intentionally to make it harder for kids to do math, harder to read. It's very sad. And I think people are starting to get it. I was going to get into this a little bit later with you, but with all of the coronavirus lockdowns going on, do you think that homeschooling is finally going to take root in America, where people realize maybe we shouldn't be sending our kids off with strangers all day?
I think it's going to grow phenomenally, Andrew. I think we're already seeing it. In fact, we were even seeing it before the coronavirus. But this coronavirus has caused a few things to happen. It was actually the subject of our latest cover story in the New American magazine called "Coronavirus: A Boost to Homeschooling." And what we're seeing now is on two different fronts. You have, on the one hand, a lot of parents who previously would have never even considered homeschooling. They tried it out and they said, wow, that was fun and it worked and my children are happy. And we learned, way more in a month than the children would have learned in a year at government school. And so, hey, let's continue this. Mom lost her job. Hey, why don't we just keep doing this? This was great. And you have a lot of that. I'm talking to a lot of people who are experiencing that right now. And then on the flip side, and I've talked to a number of people who've experienced this as well. You have parents, because now the government schools are trying to conscript the parents into making them basically facilitate government school at home. And so sit down the kids in front of the computer and make them do government schoolwork. And what's happening is a lot of parents who hadn't really paid attention to what was going on in the public school system are now seeing horrifying things. And so I actually introduced my article, my latest cover story in the New American, with a story of a mom. We had to hide her name because she still has a relationship with the local government school district because her kids do extracurricular activities. But she said she started seeing the stuff that her children were being exposed to and decided right then and there, hey, they're out. We're not going back. I just wrote another article, I think last week, about a mother out in California. They were doing, the government school at home thing, and she was monitoring her child's emails. And she got what was described as an invitation. Her child got an invitation to an LGBTQ plus hangout for youth. It was described as a private invitation-only event. And by youth, they mean children ages 13 to adults aged 25. And so you dig into this organization a little bit more. It's a tax-funded group. They brag that they hand out, sex resources and sex gear to these little children. So this mom was horrified. She said, I'm never sending my child back to public school again. We're going to see a whole lot more of that, I think, in the months ahead. And, I do want to mention something on what you said, Andrew. I don't think the average public school teacher understands a lot of this. I think a lot of them are frustrated. Why can't my kids learn how to read? I was taught at education college when I went to university that this is how children should read, and yet these poor dummies aren't learning. They must be dumb, or they must be poor, or their parents must be beating them or something, when in reality what's happened is the system is at fault. And so I don't fault the teachers per se. There's a lot of good and loving teachers out there. But I did have an interesting experience. I did a national speaking tour last year on this education issue, and I had government school teachers all over the country come up to me, some of them in public, and just thank me for exposing this stuff. They said, that's exactly what's happening. Everything you said is true. And so people need to know this stuff. I mean, the well-being of your children is at stake, and the future of our country is at stake.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you go around and you actually give people the education about education. It's something that is so necessary. And I'd listened to you on Dave and Knight talking about how so many kids are now going to public school and becoming transgender. I think the number you threw out was something like 25% of young children now in public schools in California identify as transgender. So I wanted to ask you about that. Why is this phenomenon taking place all of a sudden? And you had also said that this isn't just limited to California. The curriculum, the causes of this aren't just in California public schools, that this stuff is moving nationwide.
Yeah, it definitely is, Andrew. And actually, I wrote an article a few weeks ago. I had just been in Utah in March, and actually that's right when everything started getting shut down. So I had a lot of meetings with some high-ranking officials in Utah on education and other things at the Capitol there. And what I found out, and they gave me the data and they told me where to find it, was that the number of transgender children undergoing what they could describe as a medical transition, right? So they're taking hormones and puberty blockers and in some cases actually preparing or actually undergoing what they call a sex change surgery, which is really just, barbaric genital mutilation. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying to do this to children, to anyone, but especially to children. The number of transgender children undergoing these medical transitions in Utah has increased 10,000% in 5 years. 10,000% increase in 5 years. Now, there's no way anybody can tell me that that's a natural occurrence. And the data is coming in from all over the place, right? In Sweden, the Swedish government just revealed in February, I believe, I wrote an article about this as well, the number of transgender girls has increased there by 1,500% over the last 10 years. In California, the UCLA, they have an LGBT Sex Studies Institute. I forget what it's called, the Williams Institute or something. They just released a survey last year, and they found in surveys that 27% of children in California, ages 12 through 17, so the younger ones is probably going to be even worse, but 12 to 17-year-olds, 27% of them are now self-identifying as gender non-conforming. So, it's boys who don't accept the fact that they're boys, or girls who don't accept the fact that they're girls. These numbers are getting worse. It's happening all over the world in jurisdictions where the children are being brainwashed. And it's not just the schools. I would say it's primarily the schools, but then they come in with the air support from Hollywood and things like that, where they kind of reinforce the messages that are happening at school. And this is everywhere, Andrew. Just last week, I wrote an article in Texas. There was a school librarian at a government elementary school, right? We're talking 5, 6, 7-year-old children. The guy's like a sex fiend, a bondage, sadomasochism, big time, well known. He dresses up in leather and he does like fisting on stage and stuff. And he conspired with his buddy, a sex offender, a prostitute, a male prostitute, to deceive on the background check so that this guy could come in and read LGBT stories to children. And out of the 4 books that they read, 2 of them were promoting transgenderism and sex changes and things like this. And again, we're talking 5, 6, 7-year-old kids. And they don't know any better, Andrew. If someone tells you or I that we should go, chop off our private parts and we could be another gender, we recognize that that's ridiculous. But when you tell it to a 5-year-old, they're susceptible to believing that. And that's what's happening.
And some of these events I've seen, like Drag Queen Story Hour, you literally see pictures of adult men putting their bare ass or their genitals right in the face of little kids. I want to know why they're not being arrested, frankly. That's the number one issue I've been wondering about for a long time. Is, parents that give their 3-year-old kids hormone blockers or whatever, they're altering their biology permanently. I want to know why they're not being arrested, frankly. That's one of the questions I've had for a long time. Have you seen any traction anywhere in the country on arresting people that are doing this type of abuse to children?
Yeah, unfortunately, in America and in Canada and most of Western Europe, the trend is going in the other way. Now they want to start arresting parents who won't go along with this, and that's incredibly terrifying. Now, I'm of the belief that this is 100% child abuse. In fact, it's horrific child abuse. The American College of Pediatricians, a wonderful group of pediatricians, they came out with a statement a few years ago where they said trying to convince a child that he or she can or should impersonate another gender and, mutilate their genitals and take a bunch of hormones that are going to have life-lasting consequences. They said that's child abuse. And I agree 100%. And if you abuse children, you ought to be arrested. And what could be more abusive than permanently sterilizing or mutilating through surgery an innocent little child? I mean, we don't let children smoke. We don't let children drink. We don't let them vote. We don't let them buy guns. We don't let them drive cars. We don't let them make contracts. And yet we're going to let them decide that they want to be permanently sterilized, that they want to disfigure their bodies with irreversible surgery. Frankly, it's completely insane. And we are now moving in a very dangerous direction, Andrew. There's some cases up in Canada now where they have actually ordered testosterone injections into children. They convicted a father up in British Columbia, went all the way up to the British Columbia Supreme Court. of family violence because he refused to call his daughter with male pronouns. And then they put a gag order on him so he couldn't go tell the media. We had a case in Ohio even where a young girl, I think she was 16 or 17 years old, parents lost custody of her because they wouldn't agree to, begin this sex change process. So we're heading in a very, very dangerous direction. Parental rights are being trampled on. And these poor children are being indoctrinated. The numbers are clear. The overwhelming majority of children who feel like a transgender when they're young, 80, 90, sometimes 95%, depending on whose studies you look at, will end up totally normal if nobody encourages them in their delusions. And, speaking of the child abuse thing, I'll just throw one more thing out there. I mean, it would be so obvious to recognize this. Like if you had an anorexic daughter and she said, I feel really overweight, I feel obese, and you said, oh my goodness, that's terrible, honey, let's go get you liposuction, you'd be arrested or thrown into an insane asylum. And yet when your daughter comes home with a different delusion and says, you know what, I feel like a man, I think I want to have my genitals operated on and I want to take hormones that are going to sterilize me. And yet we don't treat taking the child to go get this surgery as child abuse. It's simply crazy. It's got to stop. And the consequences of this are going to be devastating.
Yeah, for the people that say you're not loving if you don't accept all of that, I just want people to understand a little more about the influence, where this is coming from in schools. Can you tell people where is this in their curriculum that they're pushing this? Where is this coming from? Where is the push towards tell boys and girls, you might not be a boy, you might not be a girl. Who's putting all of these wheels into motion and setting this on children?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that, Andrew. There's actually now an entire industry around this that is making huge amounts of money. So Big Pharma is one of the obvious culprits, right? They're making big bucks here by selling transgender medical treatments to these poor little children, right? Hormones and testosterone injections and puberty blockers and things like that. Big money's being made here. You also have these quack surgeons, and I refuse to call them doctors. I mean, doctors, Hippocratic oath, you're not supposed to be doing any harm, and mutilating somebody and removing perfectly good organs, body organs, is definitely harm. They're making big money for this. You also have this entire industry, largely taxpayer-funded industry of people trying to pervert children. Planned Parenthood is the most obvious culprit, right? They've developed all sorts of resources and programs. Then they have partners. There's one called Amaze, right? They've got all these video series that are being used in California. They've got a curriculum. The Advocates for Youth, they've got a curriculum called the 3 R's, where they start pushing this transgender propaganda in kindergarten, and it gets worse and worse as you go along. I mentioned the cover story we just did on coronavirus and homeschooling. A companion article to that was looking at the new sex education standards that were just approved in Washington State right before the coronavirus ended up shutting down all the schools. And they literally start promoting the transgender propaganda in kindergarten. The big backers of this bill were Planned Parenthood and some of these other radical sex ed organizations. There's another one called Seek Us, and I've got a book right here about this. I'll flash on the screen real quick. This was just sent to me by a good friend of mine. And it's called the Seek Us Circle, a Humanist Revolution. This is another one of the big organizations that are doing this. And actually, I tracked down a lot of the history of this, Andrew. I wrote an article in the Epic Times very recently. It just came out, I think, on April 9th, so people can go find that, about the history of sex education. And when you really dig into this, you see that the roots of this just come from absolute evil. I mean, the first ones to try this crazy sex education was actually in the Bela Kun regime, the short-lived Bolshevik regime that enslaved Hungary for a short time. Their deputy commissar of education and culture, a guy called Georgy Lukács, decided, hey, let's try to break down the existing moral structure, the family, the Christian culture that exists here. And their chief weapon in doing that was exposing little children at the youngest possible ages to very, very perverted forms of sex education, pornography, propaganda, things like that. And then Dr. Alfred Kinsey came along. This was in the 1940s and the 1950s. And this really laid the quote-unquote scientific foundation for why they had to do this. He put out 2 books, Sexuality in the Human Male and then Sexuality in the Human Female. And if you actually look at these books, he was very open about what was happening. He's got tables there where they show you the data. They were raping and sexually molesting little children. Some of them, just months old. They had a 5-month-old girl that they were molesting. And what they claimed was, and this might even be too graphic to describe, but I'll try to put it in, try to not be too graphic. they said that these little children were experiencing climax and orgasms. I mean, they were literally raping babies and children. You know, they had a 4-year-old boy. I think they said he had 24 orgasms in a period of 24 hours. And they said, you know, it's interesting. They defined orgasm as screaming, sobbing, passing out, fighting back. I mean, you know, really? That would be like asking a rapist whether his victim enjoyed the rape. And no sane person would do that. And yet that's exactly what Kinsey did. And so what he concluded from these findings, these totally fake science, was that children are actually sexual from birth. And so we need to groom them as early as possible to understand sexuality. And that's why you have the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the UNESCO. They have global sex ed standards now. These were released last year, where they tell you that 6-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old children need to be taught about sexual pleasure. They need to be taught about transgenderism. They need to be taught about homosexuality. You know, why would a 5 or a 6-year-old child need to be taught about these things? Well, no sane person would think that they do. But the foundation, and Planned Parenthood is a big advocate of this, goes all the way back to the pseudoscience put out by Alfred Kinsey. And that's really the origins of this, Andrew. It's sick. It's disgusting. Very few people know about it. But the fruit is obvious. I mean, our children are being destroyed.
This is the stuff that makes me want to start screaming like Alex Jones and
I know,
talk about, you know, locking them up and worse. And we're gonna keep it tame because this is Facebook and it's not even my page, so we're not gonna get anybody booted by saying anything too heavy. But these people need to go to prison. You know, there's a lot of people that need to go to prison. I know when Trump took office, he started locking up pedophiles with a big operation. And one of the things I wish he would do more, especially in Hollywood. There's a podcast, I don't know if you know it, called Red Pilled America. It's my favorite podcast. And they talked about when their kids were in these schools in Hollywood, the elite level schools, you know, they ran into a pedophile and he was protected by the community. He was molesting children at the school. It was known and it was accepted. And this is in the highest levels of Hollywood. And I wish Donald Trump would send an FBI investigation into the pedophiles in Hollywood, into the pedophiles running a lot of this science, okay? And, Mike Cernovich's page, you know, Donald Trump Jr. is watching Cernovich a lot. So I hope this message reaches the right people and people push for it. The more we push Donald Trump and others to investigate pedophiles, get them arrested, the more we can clean this stuff up, get it out of the schools. But in the meantime, I don't think people should be sending their kids to public schools when this is a possibility, that your kids will get exposed to this and possibly radically altered for their life to hearing sicko messages from actual sick, perverted people. And I had listened to you on David Knight talk about Alice Bailey. Can you explain to people her connection to Common Core, what her publishing company is called, and what that is that's being put into public schools now?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about these things, Andrew, because this stuff is so important and it's so unknown. I'll start off by saying I agree with you 100% on what you said. You know, pedophiles, that's the worst sort of criminal. I mean, worse than a murderer. These people need to be taken down. And unfortunately, they reach all the way up into the highest echelons of power in Hollywood, in Washington, D.C., I mean, in London, right? Jimmy Savile, the BBC presenter, in Parliament, right? So we know all this, and yet so many of these people are still running around free, are still running around unexposed, and it's completely unacceptable. I really hope that the Trump administration and the DOJ and state prosecutors and state attorneys general will make this the highest priority. I mean, there's nothing more sick, there's nothing more evil than hurting a little child. It makes me want to puke. And so Alice Bailey, parents sending their children to a government school in light of all this. That's my big campaign now. We put out this special report in the New American last year called Rescuing Our Children. I talked about it with David Knight and on many other shows. We're urging parents, parents, stop sending your children to school, to public school, and get them into the safe sanctuary of homeschools or, at least a good private school. So one of the articles we have in here is called Education's Future, Globalization of Indoctrination. And Bill Gates, who is, of course, all in the news right now amid the coronavirus panic, is also a central player in this issue with UNESCO. So let me give a little bit of a background. UNESCO has something that they call the World Core Curriculum. Now, this is a set of global education standards. You can still find them on UNESCO's website today. They were written by Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller. No connection, as far as I know, to the Mueller investigation, the special counsel. But he developed, he had been educated in France and in Germany, so he rejected the idea of national education systems. And he said, we need a global education system. And so he set out to lay the foundation for that with this World Core curriculum. And there's an incredible book that he put out. It's the teacher's manual for the World Core curriculum. And you can get a copy of this. You can even find it on Google, actually. Google has indexed it, so you can even read it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. In the foreword to the World Core curriculum, he tells you that the World Core curriculum is based on the teachings of Alice Bailey and this Tibetan teacher, Jval Kul. Well, and you know, almost no Americans know anything about Alice Bailey. The entire leadership of the UN knows exactly who Alice Bailey is. In fact, she designed their prayer room underneath the UN headquarters in New York City, donated by, of course, the Rockefeller family. And Alice Bailey, you know, I'll give people a hint. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company, and that should tell you quite a bit about her right there. It since has been renamed the Lucis Trust. It's still around. She was a disciple of Helena Blavatsky. Basically a Luciferian occultist who argued that Lucifer in the biblical story was actually the liberator. You know, she believed that Lucifer came to set us free from this mean old oppressive God named Jehovah in Genesis, and he brought us knowledge and light, and so we should all worship Lucifer. This is what she believed. This is what she wrote about, and she was in communication. Well, she claimed to be in communication with these spiritual entities. Well, Alice Bailey did the same. What she said was that these spiritual entities, she called them ascended masters, would take control of her body and write these books. The leader of these ascended masters was this Jval Kul, the Tibetan teacher that the author of the World Core curriculum mentioned in the foreword to the teacher's manual. And he would take control, or at least according to Alice Bailey, he would take control of her body and write these books. And if the World Core curriculum, the global foundation for the global education system, is based on the teachings of these entities, we ought to find out what they say. And so Alice Bailey wrote a book called Education in the New Age. She said her ascended master spirit friends wrote it. And if you actually read this book, what it says is we need a global education system that will ultimately lead to a global government and a one world religion. She said this global system should be based on a fusion of Marxism and neo-scholasticism, and that we should use the methods advocated by John Dewey, who I mentioned earlier, the communist who set up really the U.S. public school system in the early 1900s. So it all comes full circle. And then where does Bill Gates fit into this picture? Well, and Common Core. Bill Gates went over to UNESCO in Paris in 2004 and signed an agreement with UNESCO. And you can read this agreement. It's public. It's available online. You can find it on UNESCO's website. I found it originally through my friend, my late friend Phyllis Schlafly, a wonderful, wonderful lady who helped expose a lot of this. And she posted this agreement online. And so what Bill Gates agreed on behalf of Microsoft was that Microsoft and Bill Gates would collaborate with UNESCO on creating global standards, global syllabus, global training programs for teachers, global IT infrastructure to facilitate technological development in the education space. And then 6 years later, Bill Gates started dropping hundreds of millions and then billions of dollars on Common Core. He ended up putting $2.3 billion into Common Core. He hijacked control of the U.S. government and used the Department of Education to basically force this on 50 state governments. And if you listen to the Common Core people, they'll tell you Common Core is aligned with the international standard. I have commercials where the people behind Common Core brag that children in Shanghai and Paris and Chicago and Seattle will all be learning based on the same standards under the Common Core system. So, you know, if people want to learn more, all these articles, by the way, in this special report are available for free online. You can use your favorite search engine. Don't use Google because Google's evil. But look up in Education's Future, Globalization of Indoctrination, and you'll find all the details. You can find out where you can verify all this for yourself. And parents, I mean, now that you know, you got to protect your children from this.
So now that we're there, now that people have heard that public schools are literally, you know, their curriculum designed by a Luciferian, a Satanist that wants one world government, they've got literal pedophile material being pushed in the schools. I think anybody listening to this at this point is realizing, okay, my kids are never going to public school again. What are some of the actions that you advocate for people taking? I know some states have charter schools. Do you think the charter schools are any good? Do you think that parents getting together in a type of cooperative situation, working with other parents, and what type of curriculums? I know I'm asking a lot at once. What type of curriculums do you advocate? But what tools can you give people to take control of their own children's futures?
I'm so glad you asked, Andrew. And actually, we have several articles addressing that. So the first 2/3 of this issue are dealing with the problem, the dumbing down, the sexualization, the indoctrination, the globalization of education. And then the last third deals with the solution. So first, I'll address your charter school question. Um, in the interest of fairness, I will point out that some of the charter schools are slightly better than your typical government school. In fact, we have one down in South Florida that I've reported on. They use phonics instead of the quackery, and so their reading scores are off the charts. They're top 1% in Florida, top 1% anywhere, because they do a good job. They kind of get around the Common Core standards. But with that said, charter schools are still government schools. They're still required to use Common Core and the state-approved curriculum. They're still required to ban the Bible. They're still required to ban prayer. They're still required to teach all the other mandates that the government has established. And this is true in all 50 states. So they get a little bit more wiggle room on certain things. And that's why some of them do better than your typical public school. But they are still public schools. And we need to understand that they are still government funded, government run, and government controlled. And they're essentially accomplishing the same thing. Now, as for what do we do, as an average parent, what do you do? I think step one, make the right decision. Yank your children out of public school right now. And then, okay, step one is done. Now what is step two? Now you got to figure out how your child is going to get a good education. There are basically endless options, Andrew. A lot of really good ones, some not so good. And so I'll start off by talking about homeschooling. If you're a homeschooler, there's infinite curricula out there, something to suit everybody, and almost any of them would be better than what you're getting in a traditional government school. There are some that I would be very weary of. Khan Academy, for example, is aligned with Common Core. It's funded by Bill Gates, so I would avoid a lot of those free resources. I work with a school called the Freedom Project Academy. It's one of many online schools that are popping up that I consider very good. It's a classical education. The kids will learn, traditional morality. They'll learn logic. They'll learn philosophy. They'll learn Latin. I teach economics there, so it's a mandatory class. They'll learn economics. So these kids will get a very, very good education. I highly encourage parents to form homeschool co-ops. My family and I are involved in 2 of them. Great decision. Find a local church that'll host you, get together once or twice a week. One of our co-ops, we have different parents who have different areas of expertise. They volunteer to teach the children. So one mom will teach, Spanish if he's from Mexico. Dad will teach, science if he's an engineer or something like that. So we just get different parents to chip in where they can. Another one we use is Classical Conversations, which is very, very good. It's a national program, and I highly encourage it. It's a really good one. Lots of great online schools out there. The Ron Paul curriculum is another good option. It was developed by some very, very smart educators, people like Gary North and Thomas Woods were deeply involved in creating this. So I say do your due diligence. On private schools, there's a lot of great private schools out there. I've visited a lot of them on my national tour. And then there's a lot of private schools that are really just replicas of government schools. Take Catholic schools, for example. Catholic schools have traditionally had a very good reputation for academic excellence and for, doing the things that Catholic parents expect, teaching the kids about Catholicism. And I'm not a Catholic, but, I acknowledge that the Catholic schools have traditionally been very, very good. Unfortunately, about half of all the Catholic dioceses in America today have accepted Common Core. And, they say they're going to put their own spin on it, but it's still Common Core. And if it's funded by Bill Gates and it's aligned with Common Core, we know Common Core is dumbing down the children. The federal government will tell you, they did a study. That's obviously not somewhere you want to send your children. So it's a big question. We actually just launched a new organization, publicschoolexit.com is our website. If you want, we have a whole list of schools there that we recommend. We have different resources that we specifically say, be careful with these, either because there's some occult element to it, or it's aligned with Common Core, or it's funded by the government. So it's a huge question, but I do encourage parents to do a lot of your own research. I mean, what could be more important to you than the well-being, the education, the upbringing of your children? So put a lot of time into it.
Now that you're getting these resources out there, now that people are seeing that, well, my kids are at home, are they learning less than they were in the schools? No, it's fine for them to be home. Maybe I do want to homeschool them. Harvard is mad about that. Did you, there was a whole event set to go down at Harvard on the evils of homeschooling and why nobody should be allowed to homeschool their children. Can you speak to why Harvard is so mad and what was going down when they released their anger, their spurging out, their rage at homeschooling?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked about this, Andrew, because we need to be realistic, and if we're realistic, we need to recognize that there is a massive, massive assault coming. It's being developed right now against homeschooling and against private schools, and we're going to see the propaganda ramping up. And so, Harvard Law School, there's a law professor there called Elizabeth Bartholet, and she is about as left-wing, as nutty, as anti-family as they come. She's also the director of their child advocacy program, and I've been looking. It doesn't look like she actually has any kids. She probably has a lot of cats, but she is obsessed with homeschooling. In fact, she has called for a presumptive ban on home education in the Arizona Law Review or the Arizona Law Journal, and that was one of the themes of the conference. Her co-organizer was another law professor, James Dwyer from William and Mary College. And he has argued that parental rights should be severely restricted, if not abolished. He says the only reason that there is a parental relationship between a father and his son or a mother and her daughter is because the state confers that relationship upon the parents through their maternity and paternity laws. Now, if you have any kids of your own, you know that's absolutely insane, right? The parent-child relationship is something that's inherent. Parents love their children more than anybody else loves those children on the whole planet. And children love their parents more than they love anybody in the whole place. Throw up, marry their own kids.
I think I'm losing Alex. I'm going to check.
She's been on this for a long time. She actually. Uh-oh.
Now I can hear you. You were phased out for a couple of seconds.
Can you still hear me, Andrew?
Now I can hear you. The lag on your internet. I'm not going to say the big tech people were getting you. I think it's just the internet was lagging for just a second. You're back in, I think, a lower pixelated state, but we can hear you now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Andrew, and sorry about that. But so, yeah, Elizabeth Bartholet wants to end homeschooling. She wants a presumptive ban on home education. And her arguments are completely ludicrous, right? She argues that homeschoolers are mostly these Christian, conservative, racist, misogynists, which is, of course, ludicrous. They actually did an article in Harvard Magazine where they just basically regurgitated Bartholet's propaganda using her as the primary source. And they had this image there. It was like a prison. The poor homeschool child was stuck at home behind the bars, and the house was made out of books. You had reading, writing, arithmetic, and the Bible. And of course, arithmetic was spelled wrong, which was pretty ironic. Meanwhile, the government school kids are outside playing and having a good time. A complete reversal of reality, right? The kids in the government schools are imprisoned. They're trapped there for 7 hours a day with no way out, being dumbed down, indoctrinated. It's horrifying. So, Bartholet is a symptom of the problem. They ended up backing down on this conference. They basically drew national ridicule. I mean, you even had Secretary of State Mike Pompeo coming out and saying this lady's crazy, right? The real danger to children is the liberal indoctrination in the public schools, not the parents, right? But they're serious, and they are not going to give up. Fortunately, we have a lot of data showing that homeschooled students do on average 30 to 40 percentile points better than the victims of government schools, even on the government's own tests, right? So we know homeschooled children are much better off academically. We know they're much better off socially. Every metric that we can measure, homeschoolers do better. I mean, they have better communication skills. They're more tolerant. They're better at interacting with people of all ages. They do less drugs. They commit less crimes. They're more successful as adults. And the Ivy League universities, including Harvard, by the way, have noticed this. They're out there actively recruiting homeschoolers. Of course, you and I, Andrew, went to school with the great quarterback, right? Who was the MVP and then won the Heisman Trophy. I'm talking about, of course, Tim Tebow, who first the doctors told his mom that she should abort him. Then she of course didn't abort him, obviously, and then she homeschooled him, and of course he did amazingly well. And so that's the caliber of people that are coming out of the homeschool movement. And homeschooling is really catching on. I think what they're really worried about, Andrew, I'm sure you remember the old story about the boy who pointed out that the emperor had no clothes. It just takes that one kid to be like, wait a minute, guys, the emperor's totally naked. What are you talking about? And then it's kind of like everybody else realizes. They're like, whoa, he is naked. And wow, we can say that, right? So they're worried that one child who escapes the brainwashing program of the public schools will come along and blow the whistle and destroy the whole fraud.
I think that's exactly right. They want as many mindless drones as possible. I think that was actually the goal of the German education system that was brought over to the U.S., and I'll let you speak to that in a little bit if you want. But I have to say, when I was in school, I remember thinking, this is like a prison, and I want to do as much as I can to free kids after me from ever having to go through anything like this. It really was like a prison. And I even got to enjoy the benefit of some decent classes, the gifted program and all that. And now they're ending the gifted program saying, well, everybody should get to do all the same things. It's not fair if you teach, at a higher level to kids that are at a higher level. That's not fair to kids that aren't at that level. But to all kids at all levels, what they're teaching is not even the ability to read or do math, and they're putting in 6 stuff. So I think this has been one of the most important conversations in America is people talking about how awful the school system is and how important it is to get their kids out. I want to read some of the comments, and if you guys have any questions, throw them in now. Alex Newman, I think he's the biggest expert on this topic in America. So if you have any questions, throw them out. I'm going to read some of the comments, and then I'll get back to you, Alex.
Excellent.
I have James Hake. He says, Newman is a good guy. I agree. Teresa Carosi Napoli says, so very wrong. Noel Frisch says, the New American is legit. Chris B. Mon says, Cuomo just brought on Gates to rewrite the New York curriculum. Is that accurate, Alex?
That is, days ago that Bill Gates was being brought in to reimagine education. And by reimagine, I think they mean accelerate the dumbing down, accelerate the indoctrination, the sexualization, and all the rest of the filth. So, well,
I think they're going to lose. I think their time has come and gone. I think everything going on right now, we don't need to get into the whole pandemic and all that, but I think everything that was planned by the system, the technocratic system, where they've been pushing fear about a pandemic for a long time. I think everything's being accelerated in this year 2020, and everything's coming to light. And it used to be Alex Jones and other people, you talk about Satanists, it's like, what are you talking about? And now it's coming out. No. It's in their scholarship. It's in their literature. Like, if you don't want to believe in Satan, do whatever you want. But these people do believe in Satan, and they're trying to push their satanic beliefs on children, and this is how harmful it is. So, just had to put that out there. I wanted to ask you, we've heard that before. I've heard before the German system that was designed to create obedient workers, and that was some of the foundation of the American school system as well. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting background, and I'm actually sharing this on Facebook right now so that people on my page can watch it too. So what the actual genesis of public school, the first guy to call for government control of education was actually Plato, the guy who wanted us to be ruled by these philosopher kings who were supposedly so much smarter and greater than us. But fast forward a few thousand years, and you come to a guy called Robert Owen. Now, Robert Owen was a communist even before Karl Marx. He was such a devoted communist, he set up a communist commune in Indiana called New Harmony. And I probably don't need to tell anybody what happened. It obviously failed. It took less than 2 years for the whole thing to come apart. Total failure. And Robert Owen got the exact wrong idea from the failure of his communist commune. He decided that the real problem was not that communism is stupid and that private property and individual liberty is important. He decided that the problem was that we just hadn't brainwashed the children from a young enough age in government schools to be good little collectivists. And so he had this crazy idea that the government ought to take over education. This was back, in America when really government had almost no role whatsoever in education. The only time government even kind of touched on education was in Massachusetts Bay Colony with the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They said, Satan's going to deceive everybody if we don't know how to read, so we need to make sure everybody can read. That was the extent of government involvement in schools. And this Robert Owen, he wrote these essays back in the early 1800s where he said, we should have the government take over the school system. And that way the government can train up good model citizens to do and believe the things that the government wants them to do and believe. And obviously in America, this didn't catch on. We had a phenomenal education system. We had phenomenally educated people. We were the most educated and literate society on the planet at that time. But these essays that Robert Owen wrote actually made their way over. The Prussian ambassador got a hold of these essays and took them back to the dictator of Prussia. And the dictator of Prussia loved these essays and decided, hey, I should try that, right? I'll be a good ruler. And he ordered his interior minister to create a government education system, a statist education system of the government, by the government, and for the government. He ordered parents to surrender their children to this new brainwashing program and basically taught them complete, total obedience and submission to the whims of the dictator. And Horace Mann and his liberal Harvard backers, Unitarians and humanists and socialists, said, hey, that's a good idea. We should bring that to Massachusetts. So Horace Mann went over to Prussia, loved what they were doing over there, imported the Prussian system to Massachusetts. And then after he was done as Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, he went around and spread like an evangelist this idea of government schools. And unfortunately, little by little, states started adopting it. And then really the guy that kind of nailed the final nails into the coffin we talked about earlier was John Dewey. He came along and he took his inspiration from the Soviet Union. He had actually gone over there under Lenin, and you could still read his articles. He published a whole series of articles about the Soviet Union in the New Republic, where he said, hey, this is wonderful, this communism stuff. We should do that more. He loved that they were instilling a collectivistic mentality into the children, and he said this openly. And so he came and kind of hijacked what Horace Mann had already built, weaponized it even further, and ended up building the foundation for what today we call the public school system. And anybody who's gotten a degree in education in any American college will tell you, yeah, John Dewey was the founding father of the American educational system. They don't know as much about Horace Mann, and they know much less about Robert Owen, but that is really the condensed history of the public education system, of the government takeover of education in the United States and ultimately around the world.
Well, if anybody didn't understand where schools come from, I think they do now. A couple of last questions I have for you. We didn't talk about this at all, but I feel like you discussed it a little with David Knight, but not fully. Drug addiction is a big thing that seems to come out of public schools. People go into public schools not drug addicts, and they come out drug addicts. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I can even speak to that from personal experience. The first time I was exposed to drugs was when I was 13 at school. It wasn't a government school, and I was living in a foreign country in South America. But a very, very close family member of mine spent 1 year in a public school and ended up addicted to heroin. A tragic story. And so what happens is very much like the sex education, even under the guise of anti-drug programs, they tell the kids, yeah, drugs are awesome. Drugs are so fun. you're going to feel wonderful. You'll feel euphoria, but you probably shouldn't do them. Right. And so what happens? These little kids saying, oh, wow, it's going to be fun. And I'm going to feel euphoria, and it's going to make sex better. And, all this stuff. So they say, ooh, I should go try. And they go try. And then what happens? It was kind of fun. And they do it again, and they get addicted. So there's been a lot of studies about this done, actually, where these so-called anti-drug programs at the school actually contribute to drug use. And I think it's all part of the broader context, right? They're teaching children that morality is not even a real thing, right? We're now in postmodernism. There is no right and there is no wrong. It's basically however you feel. If it feels good, do it, right? Or as Aleister Crowley would have put it, or did put it, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, right? This is the philosophy, this is the attitude that they're instilling in children in the public school system today. The surveys show it. And so they deliberately undermine parental authority, right? They teach the kids in sex education classes and everything else that, oh, your parents are old fashioned and you don't need to listen to them. And, they don't even know what they're talking about. They're just old and weird. And, you guys know better. And so it does produce a dramatic increase in drug addiction. And it's so clear, Andrew, when you look at the numbers, right? School shootings, child suicide, drug addiction levels, all these things, these horrible things coming from the school system, these were almost unheard of in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s. So it's been a long progression, but we're now at the point where public schools are literally an existential threat to your children on so many different fronts, including the drug front, and it's very sad.
Thank you for telling people about that. There's just so much wrong with the education system, and we didn't even get to some of the false paradigms that I think are set up in kids' minds because they're drilled, and this is the way the world is. One thing that David Knight said during your conversation that stuck with me is kids, and when they're socialized in this way, like, okay, the third graders and the fourth graders and the fifth graders, you end up with a sense of awe for children that are just a year older than you. And I had that phenomenon. Like, oh, that kid's older than me, like, he's on a higher level, like. And it's total fiction. It's nonsense. Nowhere else in the real world, it's like, oh, he's 34 and I'm 33, so he's older and knows a little more. Like he's on a level. It's nonsensical. It's absolute crazy. And some of the false realities that education creates, I was hoping you could speak to some of that as well, because between teacher is going to punish you, you get sent to the principal's office if you're not obedient, if you don't sit in your chair for 8 hours, 9 hours a day and not talk out, not talk to people, not have your own ideas. What are some of the false paradigms that you'd like to speak to that public school creates?
Yeah, I mean, you just hit on a really important one. And actually, that goes right back to Prussia, right? It was the Prussian dictatorship that first decided this idea that we're going to separate kids by age. We're going to segregate the 10-year-olds with the 10-year-olds and the 11-year-olds with the 11-year-olds. I mean, how stupid, right? Anybody who's had any interaction with children knows that you can have a 12-year-old who's smarter than your average 17-year-old, and you can have a 17-year-old who's at a level of, an 11-year-old. And yet we're going to put all the big kids together and all the small kids together and no interaction between them. It's just simply crazy. I thought of another thing on the drug front too I'd be be derelict in my duty if I didn't remark something about it. Is the school's drugging of the children as well, right? So they handicap them mentally. They use this reading quackery. They make them feel stupid. They teach them how to do math in the most idiotic way imaginable. And if you don't believe me, just go read the Common Core standards, right? The only two subject matter experts, one in math and one in English, said this is crazy. The math expert said some of it, the math is even based on incorrect math. And so you teach the kids all this dumb stuff, and then they feel dumb, and they don't want to pay attention, and they act out in class. And so the government schools say, oh, you have ADD or ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder, or pick your fake psychiatric designation and label, and then they start pumping the kid full of hardcore drugs, amphetamines, right? Amphetamines for little children. It's something like 1 in 5 little boys in America today are being drugged with hardcore amphetamines. And on the street, you call that speed, right? Why in the world would you drug little kids with speed? Why would the government do that? It's crazy. And, the ultimate false paradigm, since you asked, this has bothered me for such a long time. And I was a victim of it myself, Andrew. It's what they call, and UNESCO is a very big advocate of this. They call it values clarification. And I've got some UNESCO handbooks here in my house, and they actually explain to the teachers the purpose of values clarification is to undermine a children's belief in moral absolutes. And so I'll give you a specific example of how they do this. And you probably went through this, Andrew. Probably everybody who went through government school, and even some kids who went through private school, went through something similar. They'll tell the kids, all right, guys, we're going to do a mental exercise today. So you guys are all in a shipwreck, and there's, 10 of you, and there's a life raft, but the life raft can only hold 9 of you. And so now you guys need to get together and decide who you're going to sacrifice for the greater good, right? Because you got to get somebody out of the life raft, otherwise you're all going to drown. So we're going to save the whole crew by eliminating the one who's least useful. And so, nowadays they bring in the gender, and you have a Jewish rabbi, you have a black person, and you have a purple person. And so who are we going to eliminate to be able to save us all? And the obvious answer to this would be like, well, hey, what do you mean eliminate somebody? We're not murderers. We're not going to kill somebody. We'll just take turns swimming alongside the raft for, every half an hour we'll rotate, right? That'd be an obvious answer to that. But instead, what happens is the little children are programmed to believe in this false paradigm that, hey, we have to get rid of somebody. And then they apply this to the whole world, right? Well, there's not enough resources on the planet. So who are we going to get rid of to make sure we can all survive comfortably? And that's where this is going. But what happens when the children are exposed to this false paradigm is suddenly their parents become totally discredited, right? Because mom and dad said you shouldn't kill people, and the pastor said you shouldn't murder people, and the Bible said you shouldn't murder people. But here, it's the ethical and the moral thing to do is to get rid of one of the useless eaters in this boat, and it's for the greater good, right? So the moral thing to do is for us to do what my parents said we should never do. So it destroys a child's confidence in their parents and in the Bible and in their pastors and in their family, and it also puts into them this crazy idea that morality is relative and that ethics are situational, and that, maybe there is a time and a place for us to kill a lot of people or to put people in concentration camps, or unborn babies, they're not human, or Jews, they're not human, as the Nazis would say. And so what's the big deal, right? So you set these children up with this false paradigm in a way that really later is going to facilitate atrocities, right? Because these children no longer believe in right and wrong. And the data shows this. The great majority of American children today reject even the concept of right and wrong, Andrew. And that comes 100% from these deceitful, delusional exercises that are performed in schools.
That's wild. That's something that I hope people hold on to. They're destroying the even concept of morality in children in these schools. That's unbelievable. And some other things that you were saying there that was making me think, we didn't even touch on how much of the material that these kids are being taught is false. You know, one of the famous tweets of all time, I even forget who put this out, but they said, if the news is fake, imagine history. You know, so you spend all day learning the tales of the great queens and kings of Europe, and, you know, not necessarily the good and the bad, but just whatever emerged out of history. Not to mention science. I remember being in college, and the first time somebody told me global warming wasn't real, I wanted to hit him. I wanted to fight him. I had been indoctrinated. I remember in my second grade class, whatever, going to science and them teaching us about global warming, how it's very bad, and it's gonna, you know, if we're not careful, it's gonna destroy the world. And I've had other friends freak out on me and say the world's gonna end because of global warming. You're taught it in second grade. It's part of it becomes part of your yourself. You don't realize, wait, this is put into me when I was, 7 years old by someone that doesn't necessarily know what the hell they're talking about. It becomes your core belief. It becomes very hard to extricate from people. So, just talking about how fake the material is, that's something we didn't even really delve into, but that's there too. And you also talked about Ritalin. Thank God, they wanted to put me on Ritalin. I'm hyper. You can see in this conversation, I'm getting ideas here, ideas there. I'm bouncing around. They wanted to put me on Ritalin. It would have destroyed me. Putting a child on Ritalin, it would ravage their brain. I saw it happen to my sister. My sister was on Ritalin. I remember she was a very smart and active like me, and all of a sudden she wasn't. And she was on Ritalin. Thank God I wasn't. I feel sorry for her that they did that to her brain. But it's so many people, like the idea of putting little kids on meth for years, like you say, it's the same chemical compound, basically, to do that to children. And that's what's being pushed by the guidance counselors in schools, by the teachers in public schools. Yeah, put your kids on drugs. We're going to teach them about how good it is that they reject their gender. And you said on David Knight, something else, that it's leading, like what they're doing with kids questioning their gender, it's to lead to them legally removing the age of consent. And I hope you could speak to that a little bit, because I think people don't quite understand how serious the threat of pedophiles are. If you had told people, 10 years ago even, that we'd be talking about gender non-binary and this and that, say that's not a public question. That's not something that's ever going to come up. Talking about removing the age of consent, they've already tried this stunt in Europe a bunch of times. What is this? How are they doing this with public schools? And what's their ultimate goal with it?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, Andrew, and you're right. Speaking on the age of consent and the threat of pedophilia, we're already seeing this happen. In fact, it kind of started in the United States, in California, and we broke a huge story. I got a video from an activist leader in California who had confronted an assistant superintendent of curricula. And in California, I think they passed this LGBT mandate where every public school in the whole state was ordered to teach children LGBT history. And so they start off with Harvey Milk, the first openly elected homosexual to a government position. What they don't teach the children is that the guy was a child rapist, and some of the children he raped actually committed suicide. Wow. Horrifying story. And so Harvey Milk is the big hero. But then they go back even further. The mom who sent me this video also sent me the curriculum that they were using in her school district. And you read through, and it's LGBT history, this, and they speculate these people might have been homosexuals, okay. And then they get to ancient Greece as part of LGBT history, and they say, yeah, well, in ancient Greece, grown men used to have sex with little boys, and and that was a different sexual orientation. So this mom went to a meeting with the assistant. We have it on video. I wouldn't expect anybody to believe this if we didn't have the proof. Even with the video, the fake fact-checking things tried to label it false, but you can go watch the video yourself. So the mom says, why are you teaching my children about pedophilia at school? And the lady doesn't, mind you, this is the assistant superintendent. She doesn't say, oh, we would never do that. She actually says, well, it's a sexual orientation that has existed in history, and so we thought it was very important to teach it. Now, that is crazy talk, right? In California, it's against the law to discriminate based on sexual orientation. And here we have on video proof that they're teaching little children in California that raping children is a sexual orientation. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see where this is leading. And since then, we've had a lot of additional evidence come up. One of the students in a classroom took a picture. They had a whole slide up on the screen, pedophilia as a sexual orientation. They're trying to lower age of consent laws. There's a university professor at the University of Texas named Thomas Hubbard, who is advocating that we reduce the age of consent so that grown men can have sex with 14-year-old boys. He actually wrote in a paper, a scholarly paper, that in ancient Greece, this actually was very beneficial to the boys who were being raped by these grown men, right? And so we should just do that in America. We should lower the age of consent like they do in other places. And wouldn't that be wonderful? So a very dangerous agenda. And then you also talked about the fake history and the fake science. I challenge any reasonably well-educated parent, go open up a history book or a science textbook that's being used in the government schools today. It will blow your mind. And I saw this at UF too. I was educated at 100% outside of the United States of America. I never went to a school in the United States until I went to college. But even there, I took an American history class, and I had a lunatic radical feminist for a teacher, and all she wanted to talk about was the history of the feminist movement and the history of women's suffrage. Nothing about the founding fathers, nothing about anything, going back into our actual history, the foundation of our country, the principles of our country, the war for independence, none of that. All we talked about was feminism and this kind of stuff. When you dig into this, global warming is a good example. They've got now, along with Common Core, they have the next generation science standards. These are national science standards. Not every state has adopted them yet, but they're on the way to do that. Created by the same people who created Common Core, by the way. Achieve Inc., which is, of course, the leader was a regular attendee at Bilderberg, for those who know what that means. Lots of members of the Council on Foreign Relations involved. And what you see, in 12 years of so-called science class, Andrew, they will never hear the terms scientific method. It's just not part of the next generation science standards. Nothing about scientific method. What they will learn over and over and over again is that human emissions of CO2 are causing catastrophic global warming, and only the United Nations and global taxes can save us. They'll learn that they came from slime that turned into a fish that turned into a monkey over billions of years, and there is no God, as if that were scientific. Not, and the kids, they don't know the scientific method, so they don't know, hey, that's not testable, that's not repeatable, that's not observable. They have, and that takes me to the broader point, Andrew, is that our children are being handicapped and they're being deprived of the tools they need to even try to seek out truth. They're being handicapped in their reading. They're not being taught logic. They're being taught emotion. So without the tools of logic and reason, you don't have any proper way for even determining what is true and what is not. You just rely on CNN and the government schools. So it's a very dangerous situation. And I think we're now at a point where most Americans believe very, very significant things that are at the core of their identity and who they are, that are absolutely not just false, but preposterous. And, I had that realization in college. Said, oh my goodness, I have been taught so many lies. I have to actually go back and re-examine everything that I was taught, starting with, 1 + 1 = 2. And, some of what I learned, 1 + 1 really does equal 2, but a huge, huge portion of what I was taught growing up, even in elite private schools all over the world, was totally false. And so I think that's a process that the victims of the government schools are going to have to go through, and the sooner the better.
That's 100%. I remember stumbling onto some historians' books, and it's literally called, here's all the false things you learned in school, and learning some of these things, wow, I was fooled on that one. I was fooled on that one. An excellent book, I think, that erases some of the government brainwashing is Hoodwinked by Jack Cashel. That's an excellent book I recommend for people. You can throw some books out too in a little bit if you want. And while you were talking also, I was thinking about Mark Dice and the videos where he goes on the streets of California at the beaches. He just asks people basic questions. What country is Mount Rushmore in? Who did America
Who's our capital named after?
Right.
Oh, I don't know.
Who did America fight in the War for Independence? And on July 4th, they're like, he's like, what are we celebrating today? People are like, I don't know. We fought with China. And it's the one that sticks with me most of all, actually, is he offers people a bar of silver or a bar of chocolate. And he's standing next to a silver coin shop. And he's like, listen, we can go in this shop. They'll verify this is a real bar of silver. And they're like, no, I just want the bar of chocolate. It's like, whoa. I think he offered people a gold coin one time. They weren't interested in that either. And, besides the fact that people don't know anything about the country they're living in, which is bad enough, how can you maintain America when people don't know what makes it so radically different from the countries that the Americans left? I think that's a total, horrible thing that's going on. People don't know the first thing about America. The fact that they don't learn anything practical, like, hey, silver and gold are valuable. They're money. Like, this is money that lasts over time. They don't learn anything in school. They don't learn real history, like the Federal Reserve, what's going on there. But they don't learn practical skills either. Like, when I went to law school, I thought a lot of the things I learned in law school, I thought to myself, this should be taught in 6th grade. It's
Right.
criminal that they don't teach people some of their basic rights, how to go through the court system, what's a crime, what's something that you could sue people for. Why is that not taught in 6th grade, that people don't know how to defend themselves with what's going on in the law? And that you could talk about a lot of other skills, financial skills, business skills. Nothing practical really is learned in school. It's prison for children. And I think with homeschooling, you can give people, you can give kids a curriculum that they can actually build on for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it's so true, Andrew. I mean, there's so many important points right there. And, it's very deliberate. This historical ignorance that exists in our country today, this was very strategic. And it actually goes back to Horace Mann and John Dewey. John Dewey was openly a socialist. He wanted to see a fundamental transformation of America. He actually pointed to a book called Looking Backwards by Edward Bellamy. This was published in 1888, calling for a communist America. It was a fiction novel about a communist America in the year 2000. And John Dewey said, hey, that is wonderful. That should be what we should be striving toward. But he knew that as long as the American people were highly literate, learned real history, learned about the Constitution, learned about the Declaration of Independence, there was no chance we were ever going to get to that. And so the people who want to fundamentally transform America and move us away from our constitutional system of government that protects our God-given rights from others and from government, they knew they had to make us more ignorant, and they knew they had to give us a distorted history. And so that's why in schools today, all over the country, the kids either don't learn anything at all, or they learn a phony version of history, right? And anybody can verify this. You mentioned July 4th. I actually did this experiment with 2 relatives of mine, both of them in government school. It's a very sad story. And I said to them, one was 12, one was 14. I said to them, hey, it was 4th of July. We were celebrating Independence Day. I said, what are we celebrating today? Oh, well, July 4th. Okay, what is July 4th? Why do we celebrate July 4th? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? What happened on July 4th that we're celebrating? Oh, I don't know. No idea. So I told him, okay, well, we declared independence. Who did we declare independence from? I don't know. I mean, 12 and 14 years old, you'd think that's something that a kindergartner should learn, right? The foundations, the basics of our country and our history. But it's very strategic that the children are being deprived of this information. They don't want them to know it because they know if they knew it, they would fight to preserve these things that created the most prosperous, freest nation in the history of humanity. So it's a tragedy. I think it's a crime to deprive people of this knowledge. And you're right, they don't teach them about money. They don't teach them about, they don't teach them productive skills. They teach them gender theory and climate change and, just stuff that is completely asinine. That's not even true. And then we wonder why they shoot each other at school, why they hang themselves, why they turn to heroin and crack, why they can't hold a job, why they're living in mom's basement when they're 30 years old. I mean, the reason why is obvious, because a group of people deliberately set out to dumb down the American population, and they've been incredibly successful.
Yeah. One other point that you were talking about earlier, when you're talking about going to UF, something that popped up is I took a sociology class there. And the conclusion that I got from that sociology class was that white people are evil. That was the conclusion I came out of that class.
But that's not racist, right? Apparently that's not racist somehow.
Yeah, but white people are just the most evil. We did slavery. We killed the Indians. Nothing in the class was discussed about atrocities on other continents, other atrocities around the world, discussing the current day, modern day slavery all around the world, but that the Americans fought to end it. The focus of the class, this is in a higher, the Harvard of the South is what the UF is called all the time, was that the focus of this class is that white people are evil. And when you talk about learning fake history, I mean, they spend all our time in these classes. I could have told you all of the capitals of all of the countries of Europe, all of their kings and queens. I did something called the Knowledge Bowl when I was in like 9th grade. I memorized all the garbage that they wanted me to memorize. So good at it, so useless. And then then they turn around and tell me that all these people that you just spent time memorizing, they're all evil. They're white. They're evil. And thank you for coming to school. You memorized all of the white people, and they're all evil. Go out into the world now. So that's the summation of public school for me. And I think if people can take anything away from this, it's never let your kids into a public school And if you need information on what you can do about it, talk to Alex Newman, go to his website. And do you think there's anything you can tell people to encourage them that are thinking, oh, I don't know if I can handle having my kids at home while I go to work or something like that? What are some practical solutions you can give to people? And then again, what are some more of your resources that you can plug for people?
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been such a pleasure to be with you. And so, to parents out there who are thinking about homeschooling, who are thinking about pulling their children out of public school, I can tell you now it will be, if not the best decision of your life, certainly in the top three. And that's been true for me, and that's been true of anybody I've ever met. I've never met a homeschool parent who says, oh man, I hate homeschooling. I wish I wasn't doing this, right? They love it. It'll bring your family closer together. Your children will be better behaved, more loving, more moral, far better educated. And the data is very clear about this. So I would encourage people who are thinking about this or who want to, help get the word out. Get some copies of this. You can order one even in PDF. I think it's like 75 cents or something. Go to thenewamerican.com/rescuing our children. And you can order right there. You can order in bulk. You can order 100 if you want to give one to your neighbors and your pastor and your friends, whoever it is. You'll have a lot of tips in there about homeschooling, about how to find a good private school, what the children ought to be learning. And again, there's never been a time in human history where there's been so many resources available to help you homeschool. And, if you're coming up with all these arguments, oh, we can't afford it. Yes, you can afford it, right? And I tell people I would live in a cardboard box before I would send my children to a public school, and that's the God's honest truth. But where there's a will, there's a way. Do you drive a 2018 BMW and then you say you can't afford it? Okay, well maybe you should drive a 10-year-old car like we do, right? What's wrong with that? So what could be more important to you than the well-being of your children? I'll just, leave it at that. And again, if you want to get copies of this, go to thenewamerican.com/rescuing our children. We want to get 1 million of these out. We're well on our way. I think we're in our 8th printing now. We've created a 2nd edition, which is what you'll order. People interested in the book, it's unfortunately easier to get on Kindle. If you go to Amazon, they're selling for like $100, unfortunately, but the used copies of it, but you can get it on Kindle for $9.99, and I won't tell anybody it's out there in PDF. You can get it for free if you just do some online searching. So lots of information in there on how this happened. If you want help finding a local private school, go to publicschoolexit.com. Again, lots of resources. You can always get me on social media or email if you have a specific question. I'll be happy to help. And Andrew, it's been so great to catch up. Thank you again for having me on the broadcast. It's been wonderful, and thank you for everything you're doing. I really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. For people that don't know, I met Alex Newman on the University of Florida campus back in about 2007. He had a paper then called the Liberty Sentinel. This guy always been pushing the real news, the real important information. Alex Newman is truly an American original. I have a list on my website, theandrewmeyer.com, the 72 most important news accounts on Twitter. You better believe Alex Newman is right smack dab in the middle of that list. So if you want to follow him, you can find his account. Go to my website, theandrewmeyer.com. You'll get that whole list of accounts. You can subscribe to all of them, including Alex. Thank you all so much for tuning in. It's been an absolute pleasure. This is something that people needed to hear. This is a gift from God that people can get real information and get tapped into all the resources you spent hours and hours creating, Alex. So thank you for coming on, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you again, sir.
All right. The broadcast is